I'm going to be talking tonight about a really revolutionary way of looking at healing that you probably never thought much about, but it's really the future of modern medicine, the future of holistic medicine, it's the future of preventative medicine, and it has to do with harmony that starts at the most fundamental part of life, which is our DNA. And our DNA makes up our genes. And in the Vedic texts, it was said, and this was written more than 5,000 years ago, that all life begins with snakes, and the snakes represent the Kundalini, represent the double helix of DNA. So I recently published a book called The Gene Therapy Plan, Taking Control of Your Genetic Destiny with Diet and Lifestyle. Tonight, I'm going to talk more about the role of meditation, the role of stress reduction, the role of sound and music, and how that literally affects your DNA and your gene expression. So, DNA was described by Watson and Crick as a double helix. It was a Nobel Prize-winning discovery. And this double helix has a perfect mathematical symmetry that has a lot to do with music. And so my book is about a new field called epigenetics. Epi is the Greek word for above. So it means above the genome. The genome is the collection of all the genes in your body. And what we used to think is that if you had a strong family history of cancer or diabetes or heart disease or Alzheimer's disease, that was going to be your genetic destiny as well. There wasn't really anything you could do about it. It was sort of like your eye color and your hair color. It was fixed. But what we know now is that your genetic destiny is malleable, and it can change throughout your lifetime, depending on how much stress you have in your body, depending how much inner peace you have in your life, depending on how much fast food and processed food you're putting in your body, or how much in the way of fruits and vegetables and herbs and spices you're putting in your body. So it's a really new way of thinking. Now, this slide looks at insects, the honeybee. And the honeybee is the original expert in epigenetics, because epigenetics has a lot to do with longevity as well. So this is a picture of the worker bee, the drone, and the queen bee. Now, all of these bees are genetically identical in the hive. The only difference between the queen bee and the other bees is she is allowed to eat royal jelly. So for those of you that have had royal jelly, it gives you a lot of energy pretty quickly, but it also induces a lot of genes that have to do with longevity, that have to do with mitochondrial support. So she lives 40 times longer than the other bees, despite being genetically identical, just by what she's consuming, the royal jelly. 40 times longer. And so it's really an example of what I talk about throughout the book, of ways of inducing healthy gene expression that control literally thousands of genes that have to do with detoxification, your immune system, inflammation in your body. Everybody should be able to live well into their 80s and 90s or beyond, but not just live that long, but be healthy and vibrant. I mean, who wants to live to that age if your joints have all eroded, you can't walk, or you can't hear, you can't see, you can't remember the people in your life? I mean, what's the point? And it's possible to be healthy and vibrant well into that age. You can grow new brain cells well into your 90s with the right nutrition. It used to be thought you could only do it till you're about 15 years old. So I wrote a book several years ago, which many of you know about, called The Healing Power of Sound, Recovering from Life-Threatening Illness Using Sound, Voice, and Music. And this book really looked at the cultures around the world since the beginning of time, and how every culture, except ours right now, has used sound and music as part of their healing practices. And we've sort of gotten away from the power of sound and music. So, you know, it's like trying to describe certain things, like trying to describe sweet, you know, to somebody who can't taste. It's not possible. But when you do meditations like we just did, you know, you feel it. And there are a number of ways of measuring it now that I'm going to be talking about, but you can literally measure it down to a gene expression level. There are tests called heat maps that you can do to show just during meditation, just during sound healing, just during pranayama, you can activate hundreds and hundreds of genes that will decrease inflammation, turn on tumor suppressor genes, things like that. So what is a tone? Tone is very different than just music. And tones are different sound frequencies, and they create what are called geometric interference patterns. So if you put water in this bowl and you put a stick and you spin it, you'll see these beautiful geometric shapes form in it. And it'll be different depending on whether the bowl is made out of metals or whether they're made out of crystals. But tone is sensed by the ears. You hear tone, you hear music with your ears, but your body is 75% water. It's an excellent conductive medium for sound and vibration. So you're hearing literally with every cell in your entire body. This is just a picture of some of the crystal bowls that I use, and in some of my CDs, I've played these into synthesizer and then played them into a keyboard, and you can create a lot of amazing effects on brainwave patterns, heart rate variability. So what's the relation between DNA and music? It has a lot to do with mathematics. And so the DNA has what are called 64 codons, and these are composed of different nucleotides throughout the DNA. And as we'll see several slides later, a lot has to do with sacred geometry. So this is a pentagon. And you can see with the angles, all of them add up to 9, whether it's 36 degrees, 72 degrees, 108 degrees. A lot of you who have studied yoga and mantra meditation, those are very, very important numbers that music is based upon, that really all life is based on. And these have to do fundamentally with Fibonacci series of numbers and Fibonacci spirals. That's what the DNA really comes from, and I'll show you what shapes it's based on. So without getting too much into the mathematics, you can have one and then 1. You add those up, you get 2. Add it to the last number, 1. You get 3. Add 3 plus 2, you get 5. Add 5 plus 3, you get 8. And you can see if you're doing this geometrically and draw a spiral around it, 8 plus 5, you get 13, and so on. And you get a perfect spiral. So really all life, everything in the universe is this spiral energy, whether you can see it or you can't see it. And this was pictured in the caduceus in modern medicine, and it's pictured in terms of the 7 different chakras and the coiled snakes that basically approximate the DNA. And Kundalini is a word that means coiled serpent. And it's the energy that flows up the spine. And these 2 serpents have been known as the symbols of wisdom. But it's exactly the same as the double helix that forms our DNA. So, even scientifically, not just metaphysically, we know that saying in the Vedas that all life comes from snakes. It happens on a lot of different levels. So even the Sphinx, one of the sacred names of the Sphinx is the spiraling force of the universe. This photo was taken from the Parthenon in Greece, and cameras will pick up certain images because they'll just go for 1/100th of a second, which the eye can't really see. But you wonder, what the priests, for the goddess of Athena, really saw when they looked out in states of meditation that a camera will even pick up today. So the DNA double helix is basically based upon the pentagon and the dodecahedron. If you put dodecahedrons, you'll get 11 sides, all pentagonal. Go back. And that basically forms the double helix. So this is a very interesting platonic solid, and it's a 10-step rotation of a dodecahedron all along an axis, and that forms this spiral energy. So you can see again the Fibonacci spiral. It's going from infinity to unity, and it's sort of a way of looking at our own lives, the human experience. It's like a stringed instrument, one part connected to divine, the other part connected to the world. And it's very important to keep the balance between those. Also, if you look at the way DNA is formed, it will have parent strands that will unwind, and then a new strand will form, and you'll get new DNA. So, that's very similar to the sound that underlies the entire universe, which is Om. A lot of people think it's OM, it's more AUM. So the A is creation, which is here. Sustaining is U. And then the M is the destruction, the unwinding. And so it's all the spiral energy. This is what's happening in you constantly. That's why, there's no such thing really as silence. You could go in a completely soundproof room and meditate, you'll hear. And what you'll hear is Om. But there's really no such thing as the absence of sound. What silence really is a space that you create within your heart to where you can just feel divine. That's what silence. So the whole purpose of sound is to create silence, is to create space. So the right use of sound is to create silence. But silence isn't the absence of sound. There's no such thing as that. Just the sound Om. It's creating itself everywhere in the universe. There's nowhere that sound doesn't exist. So this is an interesting slide. I'm not going to go too much into this, but it shows epigenetics. This is a mouse called the agouti mouse. And that mouse has a very pale yellowish coat, becomes obese early in life, becomes diabetic early in life, and develops cancer a bit later. So there was a scientist at Duke named Randy Jirtle who had the idea about epigenetics and fed this mouse while she was pregnant things like betaine, which comes from sugar beets, folic acid, B12, things that have to do with epigenetics or gene expression. It doesn't change the genes, just changes the expression. So she gave birth to mice that look like this, a normal dark coat, did not become obese, did not become diabetic, did not develop cancer. And this was heritable. In other words, it was carried across generations just from what that mother ate while she was pregnant. But there's a dark side to this also, because a lot of the toxins in our environment, they can affect your DNA and be passed on from generation to generation. And as I'll talk about in a minute, stress in your life can be passed on from generation to generation. So Pythagoras talked a lot about the golden triangle, and this is used to construct the golden spiral. And the dodecahedron, like I say, is 11 of these. They're made of these triangles. And this forms a ratio, between all of the Fibonacci numbers of phi, which is a ratio that you see throughout nature, as I'll show you in a minute. So you see the golden ratio in pine cones. The pine cone has 8 Fibonacci spirals going clockwise, 13 going counterclockwise. The starfish has this golden ratio, as you can see. You see it virtually in every flower, every life form on Earth. So there's a new field called behavioral epigenetics. And so we know diet and chemicals can cause epigenetic changes. And so the question was raised, could things like child abuse, child neglect, severe stress set off epigenetic changes in gene expressions inside the neurons of a person's brain? And could that be passed on from generation to generation? And dozens of studies suggest that this is the case. And it'll probably result in a lot of new treatments for this. So Champagne and Meany at Columbia found that inattentive mothering, mothers that just neglected the child early on in rodents, it's been found in cows, causes methylation of genes for estrogen receptors in the brain. So when these babies grow up, the resulting decrease of estrogen receptors makes them less attentive to their babies. So, when they become mothers or they become fathers, it's just genetics. The pattern repeats itself. You see it in alcoholism. You see it in addiction. There was another study in 2008 that looked at people that committed suicide and looked at their brains, and they compared it with people who had died suddenly of other factors, and they found excess methylation of genes in the suicide brain's hippocampus, and this is a region critical to memory acquisition and stress response. And suicide victims most often were abused as children, and this area of the brains were more likely methylated. So again, it's causing changes in the brain. So this can be passed on generation to generation. So it doesn't even have to be something that happened in this lifetime. It could have been something that happened to your mother or father, your grandmother, your grandfather, your great-grandmother, or your great-grandfather that's manifesting in this life. So, you know, a lot of the things that we think of in traditional therapy and trying to figure out why somebody's going through something, it's far, far, far more complex than that. So, traumatic experiences, we know that epigenetic scars adhere to our DNA, and so, you know, Jews whose great-grandparents were in concentration camps, they carried these epigenetic changes. Chinese whose grandparents lived through the Cultural Revolution, immigrants from Africa whose parents survived massacres, adults who grew up with an alcoholic or abusive parent, creates a number of epigenetic changes that can lead to everything from depression to cancer to Crohn's disease to dementia. It affects so many areas, and this is something we're just beginning to scratch the surface of. So Iyengar said, yoga is like music. It's the rhythm of the body, the melody of the mind, the harmony of the soul, and that creates the symphony of life. So music has been used in a variety of medical procedures. It's been found to be associated with decreased anxiety, decreased pain. It affects brain waves. It affects something called heart rate variability. I'm just going to skip through a few of these. So we talk about the soul, and you know, it's not something that a lot of doctors or healthcare practitioners are comfortable talking about. But as an oncologist, I'll see people and I'll work with them on all different levels. So I'll work with them with chemotherapy, with radiation, with bone marrow transplantation, with targeted therapies, immune therapies. So the mind is good for all of that. The mind is good for helping you decide where you want to get an education, how you pay your bills, okay? All those things, that's why the mind was given to us. But when you develop an illness suddenly, like cancer or somebody in your family does, that mind that's helping you pay your bills and get an education and do your job, and you ask, why is this happening? It's just going to be like torture. And so that creates a lot of suffering for people when that's all that they know. And so one of the things I talk with people about, there's two ways of seeing and two ways of understanding. You can see and understand with your mind, and you can see and understand with your heart, your spiritual heart. You know, that's the soul. And so it's sort of like describing love. Ask somebody, well, prove love exists. Show me the formula. You know, show me what it looks like. Draw a picture of it. You know, you can't, but you know it's there. And when you can quiet the mind through pranayama, through music, through sound, you can create that space. You can get an experience. And the electromagnetic field generated by the human heart is 5,000 times stronger than that generated by the brain. That's why you can put electrodes on your ankles, your wrists, get a nice big EKG tracing for your heart. But you have to put electrodes right on the scalp, and you can barely get a tracing for the brain. So it's the heart that's controlling the brain, not vice versa. So when we're doing meditations like this, we're moving into our heart. And then you can get the heart's wisdom. You can get the heart's perspective. You can get the heart's intuition. And then you can answer questions about why things like that are happening. It's a very different answer, though, than what the mind is going to give you. It doesn't create suffering. It creates more peace. So if you were to ask me, as a physician, what the most important factor was, what the foundation of regaining your health and keeping your health was, I'd tell you inner peace. That's like the foundation. So an architect will tell you the most important part of a building or a house is the foundation. It's not the curtains, it's not the carpet, it's not the shingles you have on your roof, it's the foundation. So if you pour a wet foundation that's cracked, you'll never have a good house. And by the same token, if you don't learn how to have inner peace in your life, you can't keep health. So the purpose of spirituality is the continuous process of experience the divine in oneself and in others. And that allows you naturally to be of service to the world. So the one thing everybody wants is to have joy. The only way you can have joy is by giving joy to somebody else. So, you know, most people in the world today, you ask them what they want. They want more money. They want more things. So you can be rich in money and not have your health. So is that really rich? You can be rich in money and not have any love. Is that really rich? You can be rich in money and not have faith, not have an experience of divine. Is that rich? Because the first bad thing that happens to you, you're going to become frozen, worrying you're going to lose it. So, you know, it really creates the constant questioning of whether I am doing me and mine. So what that means is the only thing a person comes into this world with is their soul. The only thing you take with you when you leave here is your soul. You won't take your house, your relatives, your business, anything. So for the time in between when you come here and you leave, the only thing truly you could call yours is your soul. So what that means is you don't have anything to lose because you can't lose your soul. Everything else is just borrowed. So when you think like that, it starts to get rid of a lot of the worry, because people are always worried about losing this or losing that. It wasn't yours in the first place. And as a doctor, we always hear a lot, doctors are saying, well, this is curable or this is incurable. So if you have strep throat, they'll give you some penicillin and they'll say, you'll be cured in 10 days, you don't need to come back. So patient feels good. If you have certain other illnesses, they'll say, it's incurable. So automatically, the moment somebody hears that, all these epigenetic changes start to happen, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So healing is a much different concept. Healing is about wholeness. And so healing is about looking at everything as a process. And even with cancer, most adults are walking around with cancer by the time they're in their 20s. As I talk about in my book, when they've done autopsy studies of people who died in their 20s in car accidents or wars, you do autopsy studies, you'll find dormant or precancerous lesion in the thyroid, the lung, the breast, pancreas, colon, often more than one. And so the goal really with cancer, if you haven't had it, you have about a 50-50 chance of getting it in your life. So you want to keep the dormant cancer cells dormant. If you have had active cancer, you want to get the cells back to dormancy and keep them dormant. But it's not about cure. You know, you're not going to get rid of every last cancer cell because you're not going to make one person different than the other 7 billion on the planet. And, you know, there's an epidemic now of depression. There's so many people, you know, on medications for depression, for anxiety, for sleep, for staying awake. You know, there's concentrating, doing better in school, medication for almost everything except one thing. They don't have a medication for inner peace. There's no such thing as a medication for that. So, you know, having a spiritual practice has been found in numerous studies to lower levels of depressive symptoms. So there's a lot of types of spiritual practices. There's meditation, there's mindfulness, there's chanting, puja, prayer, music, nature sounds. On a lot of my CDs, I've gone around the world and recorded nature sounds of forests and oceans and streams. And then giving, altruism. And you find with people that regularly meditate lower levels of cortisol, less anxiety and stress, lower blood pressure, less pain, and numerous changes that you can measure in terms of your risk of becoming diabetic, developing premature aging, cancer, and things like that. So, I think it's important for all of you just to get a sense that you can't get stuck in your life with, you know, a relationship that's not working for you, that's constantly causing you stress, a job that you can't stand going to, or that's just filled with negative people, and think that it's not going to affect your health. You could see from what I've talked about today, they're one and the same. You know, there's not a mind-body connection. There's a mind-body unity. And so everything you're feeling, everything you're thinking, it's affecting your gene expression, the most fundamental part of what keeps you healthy, vibrant, alive. And so I'd encourage you just to not only get more in touch with the truth that's in your heart, but to have the courage to listen to it. Thank you. Yes.
I'd just like to say that recently there was an article about the expression of children of people that went through the Holocaust in Hiroshima. Is that something, I mean, that related to one of those slides?
Yeah. Yeah. There's studies coming out all the time on every type of trauma. And, you know, not only how it affects the individual throughout their life, but how it's passed on generation to generation. So there are antidotes to it that I talk about in the book. It's very important because, you know, we're living in a very stressful society. You know, the world, there's a lot of conflict. People are under a lot of stress. There's the whole notion of entrainment. And so if you're around somebody who's very positive, very peaceful, you start to feel like that. But if you're around somebody who's very negative, you start to feel like that. And so Ahmed describes it like rust. So if you have two rusty pipes in your basement, and one is all rusted out, and the other just has a little bit of rust on it, but not very much. You can't just replace the very rusty pipe with a new pipe, because that little bit of rust that's left on the other one will spread. It'll just ooze into the other one. Then you have two rusty pipes again. You have to replace them both. So it doesn't matter how good you are, you know, what necessarily type of spiritual practice you have. If you're around somebody negative, eventually it will affect you, just as if you were like that person. So you don't want to stay around negative people. Yeah.
So, Mitch, would you, if you were in your home and you've gone out in your day, because you can't avoid negative people during the day necessarily, you're walking down the street and what have you, would you play music in your home while you're not there, so that you've got a new field to walk back into, which reminds the genes of the way they can express themselves, and then immerse yourself in that whilst you sleep, so that you're pre-prepared as you go out into each day?
Yeah, you have to look at yourself as a musical instrument. So you could have the best pianist in the world, but if he's playing a piano that's out of tune, it's not going to sound very good. Or if you have a guitar that's out of tune, doesn't matter how talented you are, it's not going to sound good. So the human body, much more sensitive instrument than that. You have to retune yourself every day. So you have to do it through breathing practices, through exercise, through putting very high vibration foods in your body that affect your DNA in certain ways, by certain music, by chanting, all those things. Anything, you know, if you look at the word disease, dis-ease, it's a form of disharmony. So it's very important to recreate harmony in your life every day, not just 2 weeks a year when you happen to go on vacation.
Coming back to your analogy of the two rusty pipes, if you're in a situation where you're a carer for somebody that is extremely negative and pessimistic, pretty much as bad as they come, that you can't get out of that situation, what's your advice for protecting yourself?
Well, you know, I don't like the word can't. You know, can't very often is cop-out. So it could be, you know, you choose not to, or you choose to stay in it for certain reasons. But if you say, I can't, then immediately you give all your power away. So, you know, words are very important. So, you know, if you're asking if you choose to stay, or if you choose to stay around a very negative person, how can you protect yourself? And you have to work at it. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk this evening. I have a little bit more of a technical question around music. I have some training in music, and And I was interested in, from a frequency perspective, from the westernization of music, we look at A equaling to 440 hertz.
Right.
Whereas in other cultures, particularly our Balinese music and Indian music as well, they use a whole different range of vibrational frequencies. And I was just wondering, when you talk about tone, in particular, what frequencies of music?
Well, it's the way that I work is more with differences in frequencies like that go into each ear, because you hear music, your brain hears music in a completely different center than you hear speech or anything else. So music is heard with a completely different center than it's just reserved for music. And so when you're hearing, let's say 440 hertz in your right ear, and you hear 442 hertz in your left ear, then your brain waves, that part of your brain, will create the difference. It's called binaural beats. It'll create the difference between that. So 2 hertz, which is a very, very relaxed brainwave pattern. You know, it's an alpha wave. So, you know, I've created a lot of music based on the differences, and when I, you know, have all my crystal bowls and everything, you know, with certain tuners, you can tune them to the 100th of a hertz. And so I can tell, so when I pick what I'm playing, you know, I'll tune them based on the differences in the frequencies rather than the frequency themselves.
I'm curious, because I do wonder if this is a subjective experience, because when someone listens to gamelan, for example, it's not the frequency is not of that you know, that frequency.
Right.
So, but for those people, those who experience it, they also find it.
It's just like the Bij mantras. You know, there are certain Bij mantras, you know, that's why you have to be very careful, you know, with how you'll use those. You all know what those are, right? So, you know, the same Bij mantras aren't useful for every different person. You could give one person, you know, a certain Bij mantra like Ham or Lam, and, you know, they repeat it. And some people, they need that particular mantra, and it'll be very relaxing. Other people, it'll agitate them, make them quite nervous. That's one of the reasons I don't like certain types of meditations where they just give Bij mantras to people, especially people that don't know what they're doing, because it can really harm people. Yeah.
Just wondering, with all the natural cancer fighters out there now, what's the reason we still use chemo and radiation?
Well, the reason is we're using less intense chemo, less intense radiation. But cancer, you know, if somebody has a cough one day, they wake up with a cough and it's not going away. And so a couple of days go by, they go see their doctor, and he does a chest x-ray and he says, got a big lung mass here, you need a biopsy. And they do the biopsy and he says, you got lung cancer. That lung cancer didn't start 2 days ago when he started coughing. It started 20, 30 years ago when that first epigenetic change happened, and then progressed. So when something takes that many decades to develop, very often, you have to use something to shrink it down enough. But then you want to be able to use natural things along with it to build up your immune system. There are a number of things that induce apoptosis. Apoptosis is normal cell death. So a normal cell, when it gets old, it'll die and make room for new cells. That's programmed. That's called apoptosis. So there are all these nutrients out there that induce apoptosis or can reintroduce it, like garlic, like resveratrol found in the skin of red grapes, like turmeric, which is what gives curry its yellow color, all induce apoptosis or reinduce apoptosis. And then a lot of the newer drugs are based upon activating the part of the immune system that cancer inactivated. And there are a lot of mushrooms that will do similar things, increase those same lymphocytes. Chaga, which grows on birch tree bark, reishi mushroom, Coriolis, or turkey tail. So, they can be used together. Yeah.
I've been reading quite a bit recently about the relationship between the gut and the brain, and they talk about how all disease starts in the gut. And just today I read that the mitochondria, which is, the major part of the bacteria in our guts, that the DNA of that stems when it's formed in the conception completely from the feminine. So the DNA of the male is not included in the developmental production of that particular bacteria. And it just got me thinking, I wondered if it was related at all to, I guess, the imbalance of, it's a pretty significant thing that it all comes from the feminine. And it just, made me think about whether the imbalance with feminine that's happened over generations and centuries and whatever, maybe there's some connection to that.
Yeah, the question was about the gut, and a lot of what we call the gut microbiome, and how that relates to health and the brain and the genes in the gut. So 90% of the genes in your body come from your gut bacteria. They're not in your cells. 90% of the total genes in your body are in your gut bacteria. And there's a huge gut-brain connection. So if you have the wrong bacteria in your gut, a dysbiosis, from all the white sugar, the white flour, the heat-damaged vegetable oils, the pesticides, the herbicides, the heavy metals, all that, they damage your gut bacteria profoundly. And that's why, babies that are born through vaginal birth, they do have a lot of right gut bacteria. They don't really so much have the sex from the mother, because it's the same gut bacteria in men and women. But it's very true that babies that are born by C-section have more problems related to the lack of gut bacteria. So it's very important to take care of your gut for everything from cancer. You have a dysbiosis, your gut's creating inflammatory chemicals 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They go throughout your body, promote diabetes, brain cell death, cancer, obesity, all those kinds of things.
I just want to link into that with the studies that I've been reading on, particularly in young children and the bacteria in their gut, and the relatedness of the high nutritionally dense foods, whole foods, and the lack thereof, particularly children who have problem. In fact, they have literally sensory issues that stop them from eating certain textures and so forth. So it restricts their diet to such an extent that then they don't get the nutrition, and now they're seeing lots of anxiety, depression in very young children.
That's true. Autism. Yeah.
So it's really interesting that in terms of the nutrition part, how important that is in relation to.
You should go on my website, my Facebook page. I have a lot of articles on the gut and children and autism. So the website's called genechanger.com, G-E-N-E changer.com. And then the Facebook, it's just Mitch Gaynor, MD. Yeah. But I have some articles on there by Stephanie Seneff, who's a professor at MIT, who's talked about how a lot of commonly used herbicides they wipe out bacteria in the gut, young children, and why we're seeing such an epidemic of autism and learning disabilities now. She predicts by the year 2050, 1 in 2 kids will be born autistic. Yeah.
Mitch, are we in a situation with the diets, even with organic foods now, the nutrition base is actually not available? There's been a lot of organics even with the soil degradation. Is there any, like, do you suggest, is there like supplementation, or is it, what's the next step now to actually counteract and,
you have to,
switch the genes on?
as I talk about in the gene therapy plan, you really do have to take supplements also. Because you're not living on the same planet that our grandparents lived on, where they could eat 2-3 servings of fruits and vegetables a few times a week and live into their 90s and be healthy. You really do need supplements at this point because everything's so depleted, the soil, and you have a lot more toxic load than what they had.
So you were saying before about trying to stay away from people who are carrying really intense, kind of disharmonic setting illness. But so we're also talking about the way that stuff is transmitted genetically, and that you can carry that stuff through a couple of generations. But have you got any advice, or does anybody that you know of approach it where you don't want to completely negate that person's experience, but what you want to do is actually draw out the good aspects of what they might have learned in that situation while minimising the toxicity. So for example, if you've gone through the Holocaust, you've experienced a lot of resilience, a lot of self-reliance, a lot of you must have some faith in these little shining moments of human, goodness that help carry people through and let them through at just the right time in order for them to become survivors. So
I think that's a very good point. I mean, you always have to, you don't have to, but it's always helpful to find the blessing in everything, so if you've gone through some adversity, no matter how bad, and you survived it, you got to look what it was in you that allowed you to survive it. And, that's part of what joy is, sharing, how you got through something, with somebody who's going through some adversity. Would
you lead somebody to consider that themselves, do you think, or is there somebody you can do it
Well, all my patients, even when they're first diagnosed with cancer, a lot of them feel very powerless. And, just teaching them, taking them through meditation, like that first meditation we listen to now, that's the meditation I let everybody listen to their first visit. So the first visit to an oncologist when you find out you have cancer, probably the most stressful day of a person's life. Got to find out about your prognosis, side effects of the chemotherapy, who's going to take care of your kids if you have to go into the hospital, real stressful things. And then I'll take people through some chanting and that meditation, and invariably people look up and they'll say, that's the most relaxed and peaceful I've ever felt. So on the most stressful day of their life, they experience the most peace and relaxation they've ever felt. So that's very empowering, to feel both at the same time. And just to know that that's possible. And so, a lot of my patients who've beaten what they were told were terminal cancers go out and talk to thousands and thousands of people, And one of the reasons that they do it is it changes consciousness. So when Roger Bannister, he was the first man who broke the 4-minute mile. So in entire recorded human history, nobody had ever run a mile in under 4 minutes until he did it. So within 3 years after he'd done it, 12 people had done it. So what changed in entire recorded human history? in those next 3 years. Consciousness. People knew it was possible. So, you know, the more people can share their experiences of what they've been through, it changes consciousness for everybody.
Do you have a vision of like the ideal cancer wellness center in 10 years' time? Do you see us getting to a point where we won't need chemo and radiation anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it's going to be in 10 years or whether it'll be 20 years, but it's on its way. It's on its way. You know, the best cure is never to get it in the first place. That's on its way too. Thank you.